please welcome author Matthias Hühne.
Good afternoon. Finding the essence of what a company stands for or should stand for and translating this into a corporate design is a highly complex procedure, as many of you will know. All aspects of a company, its history, and its vision for the future must be carefully considered. Successful designs will greatly contribute to a company's perception in a competitive environment. In the airline industry, the visual interactions between airline companies and their customers in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s to some extent differed from today, but many of the design approaches taken then and the reasoning behind them still seem relevant today, as the following examples will show. Swissair, in 1952, expanded rapidly after World War II, leveraging its excellent reputation among discerning customers, as well as Switzerland's political neutrality, to build a rapidly expanding European and intercontinental network. Swissair's success is remarkable because, unlike other pioneering airlines, Swissair could not rely on a large home market. Switzerland had a population of less than 6 million at the time. At the time, it was not unusual for airline offices around the world to create their own marketing materials and campaigns more or less autonomously, often creating a state of overall disorder in an airline's visual communications. In order to counter this trend, Swissair in 1952 initiated a design competition and selected Swiss graphic designer Rudolf Bircher's proposal for a new corporate symbol, a brilliantly simple arrow-shaped red signet accompanied by a clean modern typeface. The arrow, of course, denoted the essence of flying, getting to a destination in a straight line. Legibility in all sizes and in all distances was also one of the criteria that had to be met, as you can see up here. The simple but effective shapes and the use of Switzerland's national colors perfectly summed up key Swiss virtues such as punctuality, cleanliness, safety, and all of them, at least, well suited for an airline. I'm sorry, I'm a little jet-lagged still, and I'm going to have to take my notes out for a moment. These graphics subsequently formed the basis of a wide-ranging design program for applications, including airline liveries and interiors, sales offices, advertisements, etc. This is the earliest example of the adoption of modern corporate design in the airline industry. Not surprisingly, Swissair was the only airline not requiring any design modifications at the beginning of the jet age, which followed a few years later. This 1952 design remained in place for 30 years and is an outstanding example of how a strong concept, when applied expertly and steadily, can communicate the values with which an organization wants to be associated on a long-term basis. Pan Am, of course, was the most influential airline, a great innovator and pioneer, the first truly global airline, and a company we remember around the world even today, almost 25 years after its shocking end toward the end of 1991. From its very beginnings in 1927, Pan Am's founder, Ruan Tripp, envisioned a world in which air travel would be available to the masses. And this was in an era when almost everyone else thought of it as an exclusive means reserved for the very wealthy. In October of 1955, Pan Am ordered nearly 4 dozen American-made jets, the very first generation of such jets, and an unbelievable financial commitment at the time. All other airlines were forced to also buy jets and replace their propeller fleets with jets in order to remain competitive. The efficiency and speed afforded by jets was perhaps the single biggest step toward achieving Tripp's goal of mass air transportation as we know today. Pan Am also was a master of effective publicity and marketing. It knew that jets would require a new look. When we think about Pan Am today, we most probably recall the famous blue globe that Pan Am introduced at the beginning of the jet age. It was part of a corporate design program developed by New York architects and designers Edward Barnes and Charles Forberg in 1956. Pan Am's traditional house color had been a dark navy blue, and the logo had been a globe before, but it was attached to a bird's wing. Barnes and Forberg decided to retain many of Pan Am's traditional characteristics, but to update them to make them appropriate for the jet age. For example, they recommended a lighter blue, as you can see here, and they also simplified the logo, of course, to create the famous blue globe. Barnes and Forberg wanted to do more than the habitual update of a logo and aircraft livery that was custom at the time. They wanted to create a total design for Pan Am and went on to create many of the applications that would make Pan Am so fashionable throughout the 1960s and beyond. Conceptually, this approach was similar to the one Swissair had taken a few years earlier, but Pan Am being the leading airline, now it became very influential. So, these are some of the applications. When post-World War II Lufthansa started operating in 1955, it had to deal with many priorities, but a good look was not among them. As the company expanded into the 1960s, the need for an overhaul in its visual identity became quite obvious. In the summer of 1962, Lufthansa commissioned Odell Eicher to create a new corporate identity. Eicher was a co-founder of the HFG Design School in Ulm, an experimental college in the spirit of the Bauhaus, known for its systematic and multidisciplinary approach to design. The new look Eicher and his HFG team created for Lufthansa is notable for being the first in the airline industry to apply the very scientific and objective approach that differentiates modern corporate identity programs and became popular in the 1960s. To give you an idea of this approach, I will read to you the 5 principles Eicher defined upon which his subsequent design was to be based. First, Lufthansa should no longer emphasize that flying was a privilege, but should welcome customers regardless of their income. Therefore, all symbols implying status were to be eliminated. Second, the airline should represent technological sophistication and dependability. Thus, all technical equipment, especially the aircraft themselves, should not be used primarily as a means of advertisement, but remain visible in their technological form. Third, Lufthansa, being the national carrier of Germany, remember back then it was a government-owned airline, should represent positive stereotypes such as organizational dependability, technical reliability, and openness. These criteria should be represented by the highest degree of precision in application of the airline's new visual identity. Fourth, Lufthansa should be viewed as a company whose primary tradition is progress. Therefore, a simplification of traditional design elements and application of modern design standards was recommended. Finally, Eicher emphasized that service should not be viewed as a decorative and essentially meaningless component of the flight experience, but should instead be refocused to objectively meaningful service elements. With these basic guidelines in mind, Eicher reworked Lufthansa's corporate design. Final adjustments were made in close collaboration with the airline's marketing department, which was incidentally headed by a former student of Eicher, and a detailed design manual was created, giving clear rules for a consistency of all visual representations of Lufthansa in the public space. At the time, this was one of the most progressive design policies in the world. In 1965, Braniff, a successful but low-profile carrier based in Dallas, Texas, with a network mostly in the southwestern United States and parts of Latin America, wanted to give itself a bold new identity as part of an expansion program. The airline asked Mary Wells, an advertising executive, to come up with a big idea. By the mid-1960s, air travel had become fairly common, and the very success of jets now started to backfire as overcrowding happened at airports, and the very conservative image airlines had fostered for many decades in order to make first-time passengers feel comfortable about flying, which was new to many back then. And they thought, Mary Wells thought, that color would be what was needed in order to give Braniff a new, strong identity. Many different colors, and in fact, this was quite a revolutionary concept because no airline at the time had painted an aircraft in a single color, which has become quite popular since. They all had stripes, and this was the first time someone had the idea of painting the aircraft in a single color, not only in a single color, but in many different colors. They also hired an interior designer, Alexander Girard, to execute this idea and to come up with all of the things you see in the background, and Emilio Pucci to come up with dresses for the aircraft, for the flight attendants. And this was all accompanied by a very effective marketing campaign, which exactly did what Braniff had asked for, made it well known around the world and in the United States immediately. Another thing, 8 years later, Braniff introduced the first ever airline livery done by an artist, in this case, Alexander Calder. Air France is an interesting case study because unlike other airlines, it had a different approach to branding for many decades. After World War II, it sought to associate its operations with France's image as a center for culture, style, and art, and hired many eminent French designers such as Raymond Savignac or Jean Calou, but also, and this is very important, on an ongoing basis hired artists such as Victor Vasarely. The airline placed a special emphasis on posters, which then were quite an important part of airline advertising. And there are really no bad examples of these posters, which makes Air France quite unique because in most cases, in most other airlines, you have phases where the design was not so good. Air France always had a very, very good design. The service might be another issue, but the design was always very good. I didn't fly back then, so I'm just guessing. Indeed, this was exactly what Air France had intended. They wanted to associate themselves with art, and I think they did this quite well. Finally, and I'm almost out of time, I'm sorry if I sound a little bit out of breath, I would like to conclude with a superb and very detailed corporate design program created by Saul Bass for United Airlines in 1974. The purpose for mentioning it here is his reasoning for the use of stripes for United's aircraft liveries. Stripes have become quite out of fashion these days. I think there are really not very many left, actually. And they were already quite cliched back in the 1970s, in fact. But Bass, a very famous Californian designer and filmmaker, decided to keep them anyways, and I'm going to read how he argued at the time. Before dismissing a cliché, you have to ask why it was good in the first place. If you find that ingredient and figure out a way to refresh it, then you have something very effective. Bass concluded that the value of stripes lay in their ability to diminish the dots created by the windows, and more importantly, to convey a strong forward feeling, reinforcing the aerodynamic look of the aircraft. Bass's identity program remained in place for nearly 20 years. Thank you very much.